I do think Caitlyn's being used as a pawn.
Mm-hmm.
Caitlyn didn't bring racism to the WNBA. This has been happening. And that, I think, is what's been such a shock for all of us, that other people are surprised by this.
Subbird just destroyed WNBA racism with brutality, and it was honestly long overdue. MVPs, legends, and gold medalists have all avoided addressing these issues, but at last someone has the courage to do so. Sue didn't just voice her opinion for the sake of speaking up. Instead, she used flamethrowers.
So before we continue, there is one thing I want to reset, that we want to reset, and it's the language being used around fans. Fever fans, Caitlyn fans, new fans. That actually has to go.
Naming things, burning bridges, and carrying it all out with flair. And the greatest part, she didn't back down in a no-holds-barred podcast with Megan Rapinoe, even though she knew it might greatly boost her career. Sue Bird tore into the system, questioning why Caitlyn Clark is the object of such intense racial animosity and why her outrageous performances and phenomenal sales are being disregarded. She even hinted at a league agenda against her. Watch the complete video before it is removed.
Yeah. Did you, when you went and kind of swatted at Caitlyn, did you intend to hit her in the eye? And if so, could you just, or if not, either way, could you talk about what happened on that play?
I don't even know why I would intend to hit anybody in the eye. That doesn't even make sense to me. But no, I didn't. I didn't know I hit her, actually.
So it all began when journalist Christine questioned DJ Owen Kington about this eye-poking situation following a game. You would think it was just a normal question, right? Athletes are frequently grilled on intense moments like this. But this time, for some reason, the entire situation took a sharp turn, with Rapinoe jumping in to say that while the question might seem innocent, the way it's being asked, well, there's definitely a racial undertone. And just like that, a whole new dimension to the conversation emerged.
Obviously, hearing it initially, my visceral reaction was like, that's not good. That doesn't feel good. That feels racist, to be honest.
And Sue wasn't going to let this one pass without taking aim at the media, particularly ESPN, for making it into a circus in her trademark spurred fashion. She claimed that while the question itself wasn't inherently racist, the way it was framed and presented by the media was, well, that's problematic. Sue brought up the fact that while players of color are scrutinized far less than their white colleagues, if a black player is involved, the situation becomes more significant, contentious, or worse, a racial issue.
I do disagree with you. I don't think it was a dickish question. I think it was a fine question based on what was going on at the moment.
Sue was just getting warmed up when she made the connection and said, this is part of a much bigger picture. Christine probably didn't mean for this to get out of control, but the WNBA decided that it was, and she called out the media, the league, fans, and everyone else who allows these stories to get out of control. According to Sue, the whole DJI story wouldn't have received nearly as much attention if it had involved a white player or a white athlete in Carrington's shoes. But since it involved a white player, now we have a full-blown story on our hands with all the undertones you can imagine.
Once Diana's comments went viral, it led to the Twitter trolls and bots taking over. And what started there was this narrative of petty, jealous players hating on Caitlyn. That's really what happened. That's where it started, that we must just dislike her, that we look at her side-eyed, that we don't want her to come in the WNBA and be successful, that we're hating on her, right? So we're petty and we're jealous.
Then she discussed how this story began with the player's reply. The WNBA world was essentially set on fire when Diana Taurasi, the legend herself, made a casual comment that was so loaded that it caused full-blown chaos. Naturally, Subbird, our resident voice of reason, had to intervene and put an end to it all because of the terrible ripple effect those words create, and this time it hit harder than anyone was prepared for. When Sue says things got ugly, she means ugly. It wasn't just the usual rivalry trash talk anymore. Hate speech was starting to creep in, and suddenly the games weren't about basketball at all. Oh no. Now we're talking about race privilege and everything else you'd expect to show up when fans get riled up over something bigger than the actual game.
At any point did I think Caitlyn was targeted? And I'm going to stop on that word because what happened was these petty jealousy narratives that got formed, Then, when the season started and people saw people blocking Caitlyn's shot or picking her up full court, it then became, oh, they're targeting her. Oh, they're trying to hurt.
Suber didn't hold back when discussing how Caitlyn had to deal with far more than just the typical elbows and trash talk. Oh no, Caitlyn was avoiding literal and physical blows every time she stepped onto the court. It seemed like she needed to brace herself for more than just the opposing team's strategy players taking literal shots at her. Sue made it abundantly clear that Caitlyn wasn't just dealing with tough defense. It went beyond the normal rough and tumble of a WNBA game and was, of course, ugly and personal. Sue was honest in her assessment and didn't sugarcoat the racial aspect of the situation. What was going on with Caitlyn had more to do with racial privilege and how certain players of color perceived her as a reflection of something far larger than her skill at basketball. Why was Caitlyn receiving all the attention and being lifted up when other players weren't? Sue was forthright. This was no longer just a sporting issue. It was also about the league's larger racial context and the grievances that were now being expressed in real time on the floor, with Caitlyn caught in the middle.
So I think it's really just the fans, her fans, the Iowa fans, now the Indiana fans that are like, they ride for her. And I respect that respectfully, but sometimes it's very disrespectful. I think there's a lot of racism when it comes to it, and I don't believe she stands on any of it.
She also didn't hold back when discussing Angel Reese and Alyssa Thomas, acting as though she had been drinking too much tea. Reese, who has been outspoken and proud since her time at LSU, and Thomas, who has been a pillar of support for the Connecticut Sun, aren't exactly the same people, and they have been outspoken in their criticism of Caitlyn Clark and her supporters for racism. By this, they mean that she's giving them the white girl pass. Caitlyn is the poster child for white privilege in the WNBA, receiving preferential treatment due to her skin tone rather than her abilities.
Honestly, it's been a lot of nonsense. I think in my 11-year career, I've never experienced the racial comments from the Indiana Fever fans.
Sue, however, was having none of it. She went into full truth mode, demonstrating that this is the incorrect narrative and that it must end. She stated bluntly and forcefully that this is not what is happening, and that what Reese and Thomas are doing is damaging in addition to being wrong.
All of what I've said led to this group of people being able to push those racist agendas, which really has been, in my opinion, the cause of all of this. And everybody from this moment on has, not everybody, but a lot of people have been operating under the assumption that these narratives, particularly the targeting narrative, is true.
Sue is calling attention to the fact that these accusations against Caitlyn are unfounded. She believes that Reese and Thomas are using this racial narrative to mask their own frustrations, and rather than accepting accountability for their own actions, they are dragging Caitlyn through the mud. Sue is not saying that racism does not exist in the WNBA. She is not blind. Sue didn't mince words either. In her words, it's all here. This isn't some groundbreaking investigation of racism in athletics. Rather, it's more of an apology. Spoiler alert, Sue isn't present for it.
Just like call a spade a spade. Racism has been impacting the WNBA well before this year. This is not a new thing. Sure. This is, and in that way, I do think Caitlyn's being used as a pawn. Caitlyn didn't bring racism to the WNBA. This has been happening. And that, I think, is what's been such a shock for all of us, that other people are surprised by.
Without a doubt, Caitlyn Clark's rise has been incredible, and she's killing it on the court. But she's also found herself in the center of a racial storm that, to be honest, she didn't ask for. Bird felt that people had twisted the situation into a full-blown narrative that had nothing to do with reality, even though Caitlyn was the center of attention. Sue wasn't going to allow Reese and Thomas to turn this into something it wasn't.
Yeah, she's obviously doing amazing. Her game speaks for itself. I think my favorite part is just women's basketball, women's sports really, but women's basketball has been on the rise. And it's kind of like what Magic and Bird was to men's basketball. Like this moment, we kind of needed something.
This is
to
that
just
moment.
And Caitlyn's that moment. And I think a lot of it has to do with her logo 3.
One of the biggest shockers was when Sue revealed that she had spoken to Caitlyn Clark directly. After getting to know her, she discovered that the narrative of white privilege that Reese and Thomas are promoting is inaccurate. Sue made it very evident that Caitlyn is not some privileged player who is only coasting on her skin tone. Rather, like everyone else, she has been working hard to advance. Bird is aware that the situation is far more complicated than people are making it seem, and she isn't hesitant to say as much.
Understand why at times it's been used. It's kind of just when you're in an interview and you get asked a question, it's kind of easy to go, oh, the FIFA fan base.
Yeah, what do you mean by that? That has to go.
Oh, these new fans. It has to go because it's not the Fever fans. It's not Caitlyn fans. That is a large group of people. Let's stick with the Fever for a second. That is a large group of people. And what we're talking about as we get into the meat of this, we're talking about the faction of that group that is pushing racist agendas and is pushing hate and creating, divisiveness online.
However, this is where things get really confusing. It's not just about basketball anymore. Caitlyn is literally out here dodging elbows, getting roughed up, and it's all getting way too personal. Sue claimed that this whole narrative about race has turned into a free pass for players to physically target Caitlyn on the court. It's as though people are using this racism accusation as an excuse to go after her. Bird made it very clear that this isn't just a competitive game anymore. Players are taking their frustrations, whether they be about race.
Kennedy Carter cheap shots Caitlyn Clark in a play that I can draw conclusions from because, as Caitlyn Clark said, it simply was not a basketball play.
And Sue doesn't mince words. She stated unequivocally that rather than addressing the actual racial issues in the league, players like Rees and Thomas are exacerbating the situation by using the court as a battleground for their personal grievances. Bird is not advocating against discussing race. Rather, she is stating that the way things are going with Caitlyn is not the best course of action. Rather than uniting people, what is happening to her is driving them apart.